And we are live. Good day. Good day to everyone. Good day to Alexander. Alexander, thank you very much for finding time in your extremely busy schedule to devote it to our channel and our community. Extremely grateful to you. How are you?
Well, very delighted to be on this program, trying to keep up with the news. And it really is like trying to run in order to stand still, because things are happening now at such speed. And I have to say, terrible things. A lot of very, very terrible things are happening. And that, for me, and we were talking about this, Alex and I mean, that creates its own stresses. I mean, it's not easy to talk about, discuss some of the events that we're seeing happen.
Yes, of course. If I may, of course, first of all, I will ask you your reading of big picture when it comes to this escalation in Middle East. In general, what you think, how situation may evolve from here? It's already this disastrous situation, but it can get even worse. It's interesting your take on it.
Well, this is an excellent question, and I think we're all asking this. I think a lot depends now on what the Israeli government does. I think that what the Israeli government needs to do is to be extremely disciplined in the way in which it reacts to this event. And that might mean taking a long, measured approach rather than trying to aim for a knockout blow in Gaza right away, which might end up making Israel's and the region's problems even worse. I can't help but feel that at some level, Israel is being led into a trap, and that is indeed partly what the objective is. So I was reading somewhere that there's 40,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza, some of them apparently very highly motivated. Cutting off electricity and water to Gaza isn't going to affect them because they've got presumably supplies all prepared. It will affect the civilian population. It could result in very difficult urban warfare for the Israeli army, which is not really designed or trained for, or so it seems to me. That could result in heavy casualties. And of course, an alternative approach, which is bombing and trying to starve Gaza out, of turning the city into ruins, well, that could trigger a humanitarian catastrophe. In fact, it would trigger a humanitarian catastrophe. And to misquote Talleyrand, that would be both a crime and a mistake. It'd be worse than a crime. It would be a mistake. I don't think that would play well into Israel's long-term interests. So I think the more proper approach is to try and keep one's anger, and I can understand why people in Israel today are very angry. They're very frightened. When people are frightened, that makes them angry. I think trying to keep control of one's anger, thinking this thing through, taking the security precautions that will control this thing, and capitalizing on the considerable sympathy for Israel, by the way, that there now is in the West, in order to try to find some more intelligent, long-term political solution to this problem. That seems to me a better course for the Israelis to take, but I don't think they're going to follow my advice. And I'm afraid that could destabilize the situation and make it worse, and in the long term, play against Israel's interests and the interests of the entire region.
Alex.
I mean, I agree with what Alexander said. I just feel like we're being manipulated into a war, into a bigger war, and I don't know where the off ramp is now, or if there even is an off ramp. During our live with Professor Sachs, Alexander, and actually, Alexander, you mentioned that there might be some negotiations taking place, or at least some walk back taking place between Iran and the United States. Yeah. I hope so, because I think the alternative is going to be really, really bad. And that is a conflict with Iran, because that's clearly what the neocons are aiming for. I think there's a lot of different parties involved in this conflict now, which shouldn't be involved in this conflict, but they've inserted themselves in this conflict, and they're all trying to get some sort of benefit out of it. The neocons, they see this as their opportunity to hit at Iran. I think
Yes.
the Biden White House is thinking in terms of perhaps a Ukraine off ramp, or a way to get money to Ukraine and then just leave it alone.
Yes.
There's talks about putting funding for Israel into a bill with Ukraine, all in one package. So this could be an opportunity for Biden to get money to Zelensky, and then to just shove it off and not deal with it again. We're being manipulated into something really bad. And Hamas, I think Hamas is also manipulating the situation to try and create a wider war. But even there, I just, the more you get into the history of Hamas and everything that surrounds them, it's hard to know who's fighting for who or for what.
Yeah.
Because there's just so many different aspects to this conflict, and I just think it's really complicated, and we're heading towards a terrible place.
Yes.
Just in confirmation of what you just mentioned, several minutes ago, in Russian segment of internet, information did get reported that Bild's German media outlet Bild's military analyst Julian Ropke, did share information that up to 100,000 Israeli troops could enter Gaza Strip in next 24 hours. So that's exactly what both of you did said, that you're afraid of, that things may go worse, not towards diplomatic solution. And if that information is correct, then do you see any risks that in Gaza Strip we may see situation evolve in such a devastating scale as we see somewhat in Nagorno-Karabakh, when after successful offensive operations of Azerbaijani forces, local Armenian population in Armenian enclave was basically forced to flee entire region, and vast majority did so. Although officially Baku, government of Azerbaijan, did declare several times that they will protect all the Armenian rights, but because of mistrust between the sides, that's what eventually happened, and majority did flee region. Can anything like that, even though scales are significantly different, happened?
It can happen, but if that is the Israeli plan, and for all I know it is, you basically to move into Gaza, drive out the people there. And by the way, let's just be very clear. I mean, that would be an extraordinary, terrible thing to do. I mean, we're both Greeks. We understand our history is full of expulsions of people. Alex, as a Greek Cypriot, can tell you what a traumatic thing that is for people when they're driven from their homes. So that's a terrible thing already to talk about. But, there is some talk of this in Israel, going in, turning Gaza into ruins, driving out the people. But where are these people going to go? The only place they could go is Egypt. And it's far from clear to me that the Egyptian government would agree. You see, this is the thing to understand about this. In order for that to work, Egypt would have to agree. Now, Egypt has no sense of obligation towards Gaza. Gaza was under Egyptian control up to the Six-Day War in 1967, but that's a long time now. It was not historically a part of Egypt. Why would the Egyptians want the entire population of Gaza, Palestinian population of Gaza, the Hamas fighters who are with them, who share the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Egypt itself is at odds with, the authorities at Egypt are at odds with? Why would the Egyptians want to allow these people to come to Egypt. I can easily see that the Egyptian government might say no, and that they might try to prevent these people from leaving, in which case what happens? I mean, would we have a prolonged war in Gaza? Would there be street fighting there? Would there be some other kind of humanitarian catastrophe there? I do wonder whether this has been thought through.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, even more than that, you know, I think the level of just hatred in general has gone up, you know, to level 12 of 10, just in general. I feel like the world is just coming apart at the seams at this moment. And, you know, my big concern right now, micro level, not macro, micro level, is to try and warn against an attack on Iran. Yeah, I think that would be the really big mistake. And I think Alexander explained it well in the video that we did on the Duran that we published yesterday, that at all costs, this conflict in the very, very immediate short term needs to be contained. And then once it's contained, once we make sure that, you know, these crazies are not going to launch an attack against Iran, which could then suck in Syria, which could then bring in Turkey, which could then bring in Russia, which, I mean, you know, it's a catastrophe. So once it's contained, then hopefully, you know, there could be some thought as to how to prevent a catastrophe for the people in Gaza and for the people in Israel. There's people dying on both sides, and they're about to destroy Gaza right now. They're about to siege Gaza. No water, no electricity, no food. This is just horrific stuff. So, you know, I think maybe there's a two-step approach if I were to look at it. And neither of these steps is easy, especially the conflict in Israel. But an easier step, a much easier step, is to just, a very easy step, is to just tell the neocons to go F off, and let's stop all the talk about attacking Iran. Let's just stop it. And then once all that nonsense stops, that talk stops, then maybe they can focus in on the difficult, very difficult problem in Israel.
And exactly on your point, Alex, how you see how big of a risk is that some third parties will get involved, exactly because of neocons and these extremist forces that want to widen out this conflict and use this conflict for some other means, even though, at least for now, we have statements from the US and Israel that formally, at least that's what we are hearing, that Iran is not behind of this escalation. Iran has nothing to do with it. But because of the statements from US, especially, not just Lindsey Graham, but several candidates in presidency of US are also coming out with very extreme, strong statements towards Iran. And it seems like everyone, or at least neocons, are very much on this track to somehow provoke this conflict with Iran. How big of a risk is that Hezbollah on the first stage, and then eventually Iran will get involved in this? And of course, that will be immense disaster for not just the region, but entire world from military point of view, from economical point of view, because if anything happened with Iran, of course, Persian Gulf will shut down navigation, and that's a disaster from energy security point. Well, let's hope it will not happen. But your take on it, how big of a risk, how close we are in such scenario?
I would say that it's a good sign that, you know, the Biden White House, or parts of the Biden White House, are saying that Iran has nothing to do with it. I think that's a good sign. But, you know, the neocons are not going to give up. They'll continue to push.
I think we cannot place too much reliance on these assertions, you know, from the US and from Israel as well, that, you know, Iran, there's no evidence yet, no proof that Iran was involved. It looks to me as if someone at some level has been rushing out these comments because they're worried that the pressure for a strike on Iran is building, and they don't want to see that happen, and they're trying to contain the situation in the way that we've just said. You know, they might be in the Pentagon, they might be in the White House. We don't know where they are, but the very fact that we've had to see these denials shows that the pressure for a strike on Iran is there, and it is growing. Because if there hadn't been that discussion, there hadn't been those, that push, we wouldn't need to see these sort of things. So that tells us that the pressure is there. And I'm afraid, as I've said so many times, these people we're talking about, Alex, call them the neocons, those type of people, they're not going to take no for an answer. They're not going to say, I mean, the absence of evidence is not something that has ever worried them. They're going to simply say, well, of course Iran was involved. Yeah. Iran has connections with Hamas. That's all the proof you need. And, forget about the consequences. It will be very easy. We'll strike at Iran. This country will collapse under the weight of our missiles. They always say that about all of these things. And when the disaster follows, well, they'll always say it's nothing to do with them. It's because it wasn't done hard enough or strongly enough or soon enough or one of those things. So I'm afraid we're far from out of the danger point at the moment. On the contrary, I would say that the risks of an escalation against Iran remain extremely high.
This is their chance. I mean, just like the Russia-Ukraine, when that broke out, the neocons realized that this is their chance for regime change against Putin. It wasn't about Ukraine. It wasn't about any of the stuff that they were telling us. They sensed an opportunity to regime change Russia. Finally, we have the chance to get regime change. So they unleashed this massive economic war. And we saw it. It still hasn't ended. They're in sanctions package number 177.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy. They've sanctioned everything that you can sanction against the country. They've done it. And so I agree with Alexander. I think they're sitting there saying, this is our chance. Finally, we have the opening. Now, how that opening was created, there's all kinds of theories and speculation as to how all of this happened. But they got the opening that they've been waiting for God knows how long. And they're so close right now. I mean, I don't think they've ever been closer to getting a conflict against Iran. I mean, they're one false flag away or one Duma smelling the backpack chemical thing away. And that's it. Yeah. That's it, because people, I mean, I'm seeing the emails, the messages I'm getting, the level of hate and vitriol on all sides is off the charts. Yeah, it's off the charts.
Unfortunately, yes. If I may, because I want to use this unique opportunity to have a conversation with you, I will go to next major topic of discussions, which is Ukraine, of course, and I will ask your take on current situation on the battlefields, and I will ask your comment about this Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is formally continuing, but in my understanding did ended quite some time ago. In reality, if we take into account activity of Ukrainian side, what's your take on current situation on in zone of special military operation?
Well, I think myself that it's turned out, much as the three of us have often said, the offensive has failed. I mean, we're now in autumn. I mean, I'm not there, but I've seen film. There's rains, there's wind. Yes. It's no longer easy to conduct this offensive anymore. Ukraine has suffered enormous losses. It's captured a few villages, and that's it. It's failed to break through in any place. There's been massive Ukrainian losses, enormous amount of damage done to the Ukrainian military. The West has been seriously embarrassed by this failure. And I'm sure we're all seeing the same information, growing amount of information now that suggests that the Russians are taking the initiative. They're launching tactical attacks in every particular place. We probably all saw the information this morning that there's a big attack in Avdiivka and all of these places.
Absolutely.
But it's the Russians now gradually increasing the pressure all along the contact line. And it's been suggested to me, I've seen it written, that the intention is not at the moment to launch a big offensive, but to thin and weaken the Ukrainian forces even further in preparation for the big offensive that will probably happen sometime next year. So that's, I think, where we are. That's where the situation is on the battlefronts at the moment.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, it's counteroffensive, a catastrophe, and Russia gained more ground than Ukraine. On Ukraine's counteroffensive, Russia gained more territory, which isn't of interest to Russia, but it's of interest to Ukraine. Ukraine, their whole conflict is about showing the maps and the territory that they gained, so that they can get the money and the funds that Zelensky wants. For me, the variable is the money that's going to be given to Zelensky at this point in time, which will dictate how long he can continue to fight this conflict before his defeat, because he's going to lose. That's obvious. That's crystal clear. So is it going to be enough money to last him for 3 weeks or for 1 year? This is, I think, the question.
And follow-up question. Recent days, not just the recent days, but for last several weeks, I did notice that Western media, even some Western high-ranking officials, did begin slightly criticize counteroffensive itself because it's failed and they have nothing to really show to public. There were some statements about how counteroffensive was conducted and so on, and it seems like some major capitals in the West start distancing themselves from, little by little, step by step, but distancing themselves from Zelensky and his government. And recently, as the situation escalated extremely in the Middle East, of course, major media outlets are talking about Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine lost its first place in headlines. And in this situation, how big of a risk you think that some kind of provocation may take place from Ukrainian side to bring back attention that they had? And this question is interesting to me, especially because of this revelation from Kirill Budanov, head of military intelligence of Ukraine, that they did try 3 times unsuccessfully to take control over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which they always denied. But now they are admitting that, yes, they did try to establish control over the Energodar city, which is right next to Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So I'm interested if you see high risk of some kind of provocation that will bring back attention to Kiev regime and finances and weapons and so on.
I think there's a very real risk because, of course, exactly as Alex said, the trajectory now is set. It is impossible for Ukraine to win. And I think this is now fully understood by most people in the West. I think even Western military people and Western political people and Western journalists are beginning to see this. There was a terrible article about the war and the state of the fighting in the London Times, for example, which has been very supportive of Ukraine up to this point. And there's that famous quip we have in Britain that where victory has many fathers, everybody claims that, they played a role in bringing about the victory. Defeat is an orphan. Nobody wants to admit their role in it. And in fact, to a certain extent, they're trying to shuffle the responsibility onto the Ukrainians. They're saying it's your fault, you didn't use the weapons properly, your tactics were mistaken, all those kind of things. So there is an attempt, I think there is an attempt to tiptoe away from this. And that, of course, means that for Ukraine, as they sense this, they sense that the war is being lost. Morale apparently in Ukraine itself is falling. I saw an opinion poll today which suggested that even in Ukraine, even in places like, some of the cities where previously support for the war had been strong, these opinion polls, which we probably shouldn't rely on too much anyway, that they're starting to show decline of support, demoralization. So someone like Budanov, who is utterly committed to Project Ukraine, he is ideological, almost fanatically committed to this. He can see that this war is lost. So what is he going to do? How is he going to turn it round? He can't win on the battlefield. They've been trying to win a victory, any victory, to change perceptions of the course of events. That's now looking increasingly unachievable. So some big, spectacular event, an attack on the power station, maybe another attack on the nuclear power station, something of that nature, in order to change the perception, to turn it round. And I think that's a real possibility. Whether it will happen, of course, is another matter. I get the sense that in Europe there is anxiety now to stop it happening, and that there's telephone calls. There was apparently the last time when it looked like there might be a Ukrainian attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. European leaders are said to have telephoned European officials and said, for heaven's sake, don't do it. So it might be that we see something like that happen again. But you ask the question, an event like that, is it possible? Absolutely, it is.
Yeah, Zelensky was he put out a tweet, and he was on his video program, his Instagram, TikTok video that he does every other evening, and he's like trying to connect Russia to what's going on in Israel,
Yes.
like desperate to connect Russia to what's going on in Israel. And of course, at the end of his Twitter post, he just comes back to the same point, which is, we have a way to defeat Russia. Give me money, give me weapons. I mean, he always ends up at that same point that I think people are just tired of. And if I was the Biden White House, I mean, if I was like advising the Biden White House, this is a cynical view to have, but I would say, you want to give him 10, 20, 30 billion, fine, but give it to him and let's not talk about it anymore. And I really think that most people in the West, especially in the United States, they've already forgotten about it. I mean, I really think that this is not going to be. I mean, if the Biden White House can resist its urges because they're so into Ukraine. I mean, they're so addicted to Ukraine. But if they can resist their urges, then I think they've got a way out of this from a media perspective. I'm saying from a media perspective and from an election cycle perspective. That's how I see things. Europe is a different story. I think Europe is screwed. I don't have another word to use to describe it. I mean, Europe is done. But the European leadership, they did it to their countries. They did it to themselves. And I say that as someone who lives in Europe and the EU. As Greeks, as Cypriots, we did it to ourselves. We did. But what can we do? As a citizen there, what can I do? I mean, my prime minister, my president, they made the wrong decision, or maybe they didn't have a choice. They didn't have any other choice. They had to go along with what Ursula dictated to them. But I don't believe that. But that's what they'll tell you. We didn't have a choice. I know what the politicians in Cyprus and Greece are already saying. I know what they're already saying. What can we do? The EU told us to close our airspace and impose sanctions. What can we do? We're a small little country. We do as they tell us. Now, citizens suffer the economic consequences of all of this.
To continue with the topic of Ukraine, I may be mistaken, but my understanding is that if longer this conflict continues, higher risk that eventually Ukraine will lose its statehood, and this state will be disintegrated entirely, and majority of territory eventually will end up under Russian control. And I think Western regions, they're highly likelihood, in my reading, and I may be mistaken, but there is high chance in my understanding that Western regions, we may become under control of Poland, Hungary, Romania, possibly Slovakia. Do you see such possibility, such a scenario evolved in if this conflict continues? If it will stop right now or in next month or two, that's a different story. But if it continues, then Russian side, I guess, will have a lesser and lesser desire to find any agreement with Zelensky and his associates, even though already for Moscow probably going to be extremely difficult to talk to these people.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it is extremely unlikely indeed. I would have said all but inconceivable that this war is going to end in the next 1 or 2 or 3 months with any kind of negotiated solution. I mean, the Western powers are incapable of making a serious diplomatic proposal to the Russians, and the Ukrainian government is incapable of making a serious diplomatic proposal to the Russians. And I'm going to add, by the way, that even as the situation deteriorates, which it will, I suspect that will not change. I mean, they've had many opportunities to negotiate a solution. But I think both in the West and in Ukraine, for different reasons, it's actually easier to accept a defeat than to actually negotiate with the Russians and agree a compromise which would not actually be in reality a compromise. It would be Ukraine and the West accepting Russian terms. So I don't think they want to do that. I mean, rather see Ukraine destroyed. I mean, people like Budanov, whom you mentioned, I think he's worked himself into that sort of mindset where, you know, a heroic defeat or something that he could describe as a heroic defeat is more consistent with his own belief systems and his own conception of himself and Ukraine than some kind of compromise. And I think that's the attitude in Ukraine. And if you're talking about the United States and Britain and West European governments, how do they negotiate a compromise with the Russians, opening up issues like NATO and the security architecture of Europe, and do so after a defeat, because that's what it would amount to, and then have to explain to their people, well, you know, we could have had this deal before, but we didn't go for it then. And we've had all the sanctions and all the economic difficulties and the crisis and the deindustrialization in Germany. And that was all for nothing. And, well, we could have avoided it if we'd agreed to all of that before. They don't want to accept that. So, again, rather have Ukraine destroyed, absorbed into Russia, establish the narrative of Russian expansionism and of the threat from Moscow, then come to any kind of agreement. I say all of this, you know, I don't like to say this, but that, it seems to me, is the reality. And I'm about what you said, Levan, that if there isn't an agreement, and as I said, I don't see an agreement, that the outcome could very well be the end of the Ukrainian state. I have no doubt that that is correct. We're seeing increasing numbers of Russians talking about this. Medvedev is talking about it. Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma, is talking about it. Shoigu, in a somewhat different way, is talking about it. Even Putin is now starting to hint at it, and increasingly so. So it could very well be that that is the outcome. And one can easily see a scenario where the Russians control all the territory east of the Dnieper, and perhaps also, in fact, definitely, I would say, Odessa, which Putin pointedly now said is a Russian city with, you know, a bit of Jewish people there as well, but, you know, a Russian city. And, well, perhaps the Russians imagine some kind of statelet left around Kiev, the center of Ukraine, territorially big, but who knows how viable that is. Western Ukraine carved up, Poland takes its bit, Hungary takes its bit, Romania takes its bit, but there's a large area still left. I don't doubt that anybody would really want it, and it would be a sad, broken place, very humiliated, very reduced, and one wonders what the future for the people there would be. So, I mean, I can easily see that scenario unfolding now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the Zelensky regime, Budanov, these guys, they want the weapons and the money so they could just buy some time. That's my sense of things. They just want to figure out a way for them to get out of this. I don't even know if it's about if they even believe that Ukraine can win. I doubt it. Maybe Budanov might, because the guy's psychopath, but I'm positive that many of Zelensky's staff, his administration, is probably like, look, I need 6 more months or another year to figure things out. How do I do what Reznikov did? How do I get to London? How do I get out of this? We did a video and we actually said when Reznikov was fired, we were actually like joking around, but it's true. We were like, he's lucky he got out. He's like the lucky one, right? And I think that's what's going on here. They're trying to buy some time. They want weapons and money to give them a little more runway to figure out their exit. Because that I have the sense that going off of what Alexander said, I really have the sense that what the U.S. could do, what the Biden White House could do during the election, they could, everyone could be focused on the conflict in Israel, rightly so. But no one talks about Ukraine. So the counteroffensive is forgotten, another month or two. And if you even mention the counteroffensive, people will be like, what are you talking about? There was a counteroffensive. I don't remember that. So they deal with the loss of the counteroffensive by just not admitting to a loss and letting, time wash it away. And then I can see the Biden White House, when Russia wins and takes whatever territory it takes, and if Poland takes a piece, if Romania, I don't know, but whoever goes into Ukraine and decides to take whatever territory they want to take, I can see the Biden White House coming out and saying, Russia's done a horrible thing. They've taken Odessa. We condemn this action, and we did everything we could to support the people of Ukraine, and that's that. I mean, this is my sense of where we're heading. Especially if the conflict in Israel, in Gaza, is a long conflict, then I think this is where we're heading. If it's a short conflict, then I think we will circle back around to Ukraine. That would be my hunch.
If I may, I will change the subject of conversation once again. I truly want to use this opportunity to discuss as many topics as possible. So next is Russian economy, influence of Western sanctions on Russian economy. What is your take on it? Do those sanctions work? No. What chances are that, or as Alex already pointed out, what else they gonna sanction? I mean, this globalist or whoever they are. What is their next step to somehow influence Russia's politics or economy or whatever? And also, Alex was in Russia just recently. And what was your how you see Russia? Is sanctions that destroy Russian economy, as Ursula wants to say time to time, or what is your expression from Russia? Also, will be interesting.
When I was in Russia, it was vibrant, energetic, normal, I guess, in a way. I mean, it's hard to describe it other than just say it was business as usual. Look, if you're traveling from the West to Russia now, it's a different travel experience. It's not like it used to be, where I could travel where I could fly direct from Greece to Moscow, where we had a direct flight. We don't have that anymore. So you have to go transit somewhere. Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, Dubai. Okay, you have to find the connections, and when you get to Russia, at least the first time when you're there, you're going to have to set some things up. The internet needs a bit of navigation because there are some sites that are blocked. You need a good VPN on your computer. You need a VPN on your mobile device. That's just the reality of the situation. And then, of course, you have what I consider to be the big problem for someone visiting Russia, and that is the payment problem. I think that's the big problem. If the Russian Foreign Ministry can solve this, then I think they'll get a big boom in tourism, even from the West. Because when you go to Russia now, you're on the Visa and MasterCard, and you have your bank in Greece, in my case, or Cyprus, and obviously that's not working in Russia. So you have to get the Mir card, or you have to find a way to make payments or bring cash, and constantly go and exchange. This is I think the one difficulty, the one big difficulty when traveling to Russia. Outside of that, it's just normal. The cafes are full, the restaurants are full, people are happy, people are very confident, very energetic. I think they're not missing Europe at all. I mean, at all. And it's business as usual. There's a lot of opportunity in Russia now. I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Yes. And when it comes to Alexander, sorry.
No, I just very quickly say, I think the sanctions are working, but in the opposite way of the ones intended. I think what they're doing, actually, is they're providing an enormous stimulus to the economy in Russia. Of course, when you get a stimulus, it does sometimes have negative effects. So you see the sort of movements in the ruble, and you've had higher prices for many things and things like that. But of course, the underlying story in Russia is of a big production surge, which is now affecting the entire range of Russian industry. And also a rise in living standards, which is, living standards are outpacing prices. Now, that is a problem because, of course, you don't want to get into a wage price spiral, and the central bank is very worried about this, and they're worrying about that, and understandably and rightly so, and they're taking the various steps. But what we have seen is that the sanctions, they've actually broken some of the chains that were actually keeping the economy back, where there's now all kinds of niches and spaces in the economy that were filled by Western brands and Western products, and they're now being filled by the Russians, by Russian ones. As Alex said, lots of opportunities as well. And beyond that, a whole chain of economic linkages that probably work better for the Russians in the long term. We see the Russians establishing relations now with Central Asia. We've had meetings. We had the prime minister of the presidents of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, one after the other in Russia. We've talked about setting up factories there. The Russians exporting, is it gas or oil to Central Asia, which seems incredible, but that's apparently happening. We see all of these things coming together with, of course, with China, with India as well. And in some ways, these are better partners for the Russians. It makes more sense for them because not only is the history much easier, it can be negotiated much better. You don't have all the baggage that you have in trying to deal with things with Europe. But the Russians are in a stronger position anyway, dealing economically with these countries. So I think this is a big liberating moment. As I said, there are teething problems which will be undoubtedly overcome. But in the long term, this is actually a time of opportunity and a time for advantage. And I think the Russians themselves underestimated the extent of this and are astonished by it.
To continue topic of Russia, you just mentioned relationships between Russia, Central Asian republics, China, also India, global South in general, increase trade relationships, diplomatic relationships, and so on. And I have a question. In its attempt to isolate Russia, did the Western ruling class began to isolate Western world itself from rest of the world? Because it seems like in the long run, in 10, 15 years time, if with continuing development of BRICS, possibly BRICS currency, this process of de-dollarization, that's eventually when we may end up somewhere in I don't know, 10, 15 years time, that it's West that may find itself isolated from rest of the world, which will establish new financial institutions, just new field of opportunities, really, and relationships. Is it possible? Is such a possibility?
Well, I would say absolutely. And I think this is exactly what has happened. I think this is the major mistake. I think the West assumed back in February and March of last year that they would be able to use this conflict to isolate the Russians. In fact, what they discovered was that most of the world outside Europe and the United States had long ago figured out what the realities were about the conflict in Ukraine. They knew about the fact that the Minsk agreement had never been implemented. They knew perfectly well what had been happening in Kiev and who was behind the events in 2004, the Orange Revolution, and in 2014 with the Maidan events and all of that, the Revolution of Dignity, as it's called. I think you perfectly well who it was. And of course, because there's been this big shift in global economic power, it was possible for countries around the world to say to the West, well, look, we hear what you say, but we don't agree. And we're going to go on trading with the Russians exactly as we did before. And, if you want to press us to try to line up behind you, well, we're going to say no. And we are not frightened of you anymore. And I think this crisis acted as the catalyst for this. It's accelerated the drift away from the West and, in a sense, the kind of isolation of the West that you're talking about. And of course, now there's this alternative structure which is being created, the BRICS structure, which we discussed, by the way, with Professor Sachs earlier in our program today. The fact that there's now a new financial system being created, underpinning a new trading system. As Professor Sachs pointed out, doing this, it has its problems, but it's not insuperably difficult. And what we're going to see is that there's going to be a new trading system, distinct from that of the West. And in some ways, the BRICS country that was most integrated with the West, to a degree that people don't fully understand, up to this point was Russia. And it's now going to start moving away. One of the things that people talk about a lot, for example, all the time, every day I have people emailing me about this, which is about the ruble going up, the ruble going down. People talk about the ruble. What I think people don't understand is that this isn't going to be a story for very much longer, because before long, just as is the case with the RMB, the Chinese currency, with the rupee, the Indian currency, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be as easy as it is at the moment, even theoretically, to convert rubles into euros and dollars. It will be much more controlled. There will be much tighter capital controls, because the whole plan of making the ruble fully convertible, of interconnecting everything to the SWIFT interbank system, was about integrating Russia with the West, and that has gone. So you don't need to do that anymore. You have this alternative system that is going to be created, and that's where the interconnections of the future are going to be. So this is a huge mistake. It was based on a complete misunderstanding, both about Russian realities, which we've talked about many times on our programs, Alex and I, and which you have also talked about, Levan, but also about the realities of how the world is developing and changing all the time. It was the biggest miscalculation that has been made since, frankly, the end of the Second World War.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, who cares if you're in Russia? What do you care about the dollar ruble or the euro ruble? I
Uh,
mean,
uh,
it's meaningless. It really is. I mean, the only reason, like for an everyday citizen, the only reason to have cared about, like the dollar ruble would be like, okay, I'm in Russia and I'm going to travel to London or to Paris.
yes.
There, I could say, oh man, our currency is just really weak against the
Um,
euro, whatever. So it's going to be it's a holiday that I just can't take, or these are Nikes or whatever, Adidas shoes, whatever, that I just can't buy. They're just it's just too much. But you can't do that anyway, even if you wanted to. Not for everybody, but most people, 90%, 95% of Russians, to travel now to Paris or whatever is a pain. It's
yes.
you already have the
Uh,
connection, so it doesn't matter. The whole everyone looking at the ruble exchange is
I
it's
can
not
tell
important.
you, even though ruble is in turbulence for quite some time now, when I go to store and to buy everyday stuff, food, so on, uh, I don't really notice any extreme rise of inflation, and that's possibly because this parallel or not parallel import, although it does works, but that's because uh, Russian government did began talking about or supporting local production 10, 15 years ago. And at this point, we are now in the place when you go to shop, most of it, what you see, is produced here in Russia. And therefore, government probably does has some tools to make sure that these companies that want to make money, of course, that's what business does, those companies will not speculate extremely on prices, and therefore there is not huge inflation rate, which is surprising to me also, but probably that's one of the reasons that products are produced in Russia nowadays. Although, of course, China, India, other countries worldwide are also trading with Russia, and also before I change subject, I had thoughts that if uh, if Western ruling class will not change its policies towards Russia, uh, it may very well come that I mean, another way to say I think Europe with Russia is a global player in decades to come. But Europe, especially Europe, without Russia, it may become some uh, loosely relevant region of Eurasian continent. Is it any true in this?
Well, it is absolutely true. I mean, this is one of the great baffling things because I used to hear people say this is in Britain, in London, that without Russia, Europe is incomplete. We need Russia. We need its resources. We need its people. We have to sort of find some way to integrate. There were people who talked like this, and the problem was that it turned out very clearly that their conception of Russia in Europe was not Russia in Europe or Europe together with Russia. It was Europe controlling Russia.
Controlling Russia, yes.
And of course, that was never going to work. And that original analysis that you wanted to bring the two together in order to make Europe a big player, that was, of course, was absolutely right. But the way they chose to do it guaranteed its failure. And of course, the problems with Europe that we see, and it's unfortunately come on top of a whole succession of big European mistakes, British mistakes, but also European mistakes, going all the way back to the time when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Europeans decided that they would expand the EU. They would centralize the EU. They would move from an economic confederation of sovereign states into this kind of semi-union. It was never really planned, never really thought through. A single currency was created. All of these things all happened. at about the same time, in the sort of intoxication of the moment. And a structure was thereby created, which has Europe trapped and which is pulling it down. And I agree. I think you're absolutely right. Without Russia, we're going to become a province, if you like, of the greater community of the world. Most of the big things are going to happen elsewhere. But we've done it to ourselves.
Alex?
Yeah, I don't have anything to have. We've done it to ourselves, yeah.
To continue same topic, can EU or will EU and NATO also survive this confrontation with Russia? At this point, it's political, economical, but this confrontation and also Ukrainian crisis, because one day or another Ukrainian crisis gonna end. And will it become a reason for further divide inside these organizations and eventual fall?
My own personal view, and I've expressed this many times, independent of the Ukrainian crisis, is that NATO and the EU, in their present form, are unsustainable, have been unsustainable for a very long time. And we've discussed many times on the Duran the skill some European politicians have shown in kicking the can down the road, letting the problems accumulate and grow bigger, but somehow always finding the device, the way round that would just keep this show running for a little bit longer. I think they're starting to run out of road. But anyway, they might be able to keep that going. But eventually, this structure is unsustainable. And when the Ukrainian crisis ends with a defeat, and it will be a defeat, and it will not be possible to take away from the fact that it is a defeat, I think it will be a massive psychological blow to this entire project. Because the point about this project, the only way it's been able to keep going is by constant forward movement in terms of expansion and forward movement in terms of integration. And if it all comes to a juddering stop in the conflict in Ukraine, then I think even allowing for, as I said, the skill in kicking the can down the road, I think that it will be such a big psychological blow that I think you will start to see the problems starting to intensify and accelerate. In fact, you're already seeing them. If you live in Europe, if you live in Britain, you can see this visible around you all the time.
And Alex?
Yeah, if NATO and the EU, if they can't grow, then what's their purpose? I mean, that's their goal. Their goal is to expand. And so
they already.
Yeah, I mean, NATO has to get through Russia. That has to get Ukraine. Has to expand further. You go Ukraine, then you go Georgia, then you go Armenia, and you can go through Eurasia till you get to China. I guess that's NATO's business plan. That's their business model there. But I mean, if you can't get past Ukraine, where do you go? Okay, they're going to let in Moldova. They'll let in if you have Finland, Sweden. That's it. I mean, there's nowhere else for them to really go. So what's the purpose of it?
Alex just mentioned Georgia, Armenia. Can I ask, this is next subject that I want to discuss with you, situation in Southern Caucasus region. It's always tense situation there for many reasons. It's historically, unfortunately, since collapse of Soviet Union, it's historically the case. And what is your take? How high a risk that this region also may become a next hotspot on the geopolitical map? And also, due to recent events in Azerbaijan around Karabakh region, there are some informations that are circulating in Russian public domain, at least, that the current leadership of Armenia or their plans and their partners, let's say, in the USA, in France, in the Western states, is to fast track Armenia towards EU and the NATO, because now once this issue of Karabakh somewhat resolved very dramatically for local residents, Armenia formally are not in conflict with anybody, at least for now. And simultaneously, if we take in account that I don't think Turkey needs NATO bases or US bases in Armenia, Iran definitely don't need this. Azerbaijan don't need this. How high risk also that some provocation may happen between Armenia and Azerbaijan yet again. For example, land bridge, to cut land bridge between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan Autonomous Republic, which is bordering Iran, Turkey, and Armenia, but not Azerbaijan itself. And this issue of land corridor is constantly discussed in Azerbaijan. So can it happen this way, that Armenia losing Nagorno-Karabakh will lose also chance to join NATO or EU by ending up in another conflict, now directly with Azerbaijan?
Well, indeed, I think that's exactly the danger. Now, I should say my brother, who's been to Armenia many, many times, he said to me, one of the most striking things you notice when you are in Yerevan is the sheer size of the American embassy. He says it is simply enormous. It is absolutely gigantic. I mean, there's a park near my house, which is a large park, and he says it is at least as big as that. Why do you have such a colossal American embassy in Yerevan? Well, there's only one reason, because the United States has aimed for some time, and it is always the United States, by the way. I mean, Brussels always follows, but it's always the United States that leads. They want to insert themselves into the Southern Caucasus. They tried something in Georgia with Saakashvili, and it didn't turn out very well. So now they've looked to Armenia. That's, I think, what the Pashinyan business is all about at the end of the day. And I mean, apparently, and I've heard this rumor, apparently it's circulating in the US actually, that the idea was that Pashinyan was persuaded by the Europeans to acknowledge Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh. And the idea was that there would then be a negotiation. Pashinyan and the Armenians would transfer peacefully Nagorno-Karabakh to Baku, and there would be some kind of peace agreement which the European Union would broker, and then that would open up the way for Armenia to join first the EU and then perhaps NATO, or the other way around. And of course, what happened was Azerbaijan doesn't want Armenia in NATO. Turkey doesn't want Armenia in NATO, despite Turkey itself being a NATO country. Iran, absolutely, as you rightly said, doesn't want it. And of course, Russia doesn't want it. So what actually happened was the Azerbaijanians, who were not fools, they could see this coming. They said very simply, look, Armenia now accepts our sovereignty over this region. So why shouldn't we simply march in? And that is what they did. And it was not, apparently, according to this theory, what was anticipated in Brussels or in Washington. And of course, it's left Pashinyan in a much more precarious position. And of course, from an Azerbaijanian point of view, they don't want a peace treaty with Armenia anyway at this time, until these issues of the land bridge to Nakhichevan and all of those things are sorted out. So they weren't looking for that kind of swap that was being thought about, give Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan and then you can join the EU. The Azerbaijanians are saying, well, let's take it all. Let's just take Nagorno-Karabakh. We don't want a peace treaty. We're not going to turn up when the EU tries to conduct negotiations. Aliyev refused to go to Grenada. Yes. And we bide our time. And the next thing we do is we come after the land bridge as well. And that's the miscalculation that was made. And what we see, and as somebody with your roots in the Southern Caucasus, you can see how these American and European plans, all these devices, all these schemes and intrigues, what they're actually doing is they're causing problems for the nations in these regions. They try to draw Georgia into the NATO system. They promised that Georgia would one day join NATO. And what happened? There was a war in 2008. Georgia has lost South Ossetia. It's lost Abkhazia. The Russians have recognized it. There's been a military defeat. And they're trying to do the same with Armenia. And Armenia has lost Nagorno-Karabakh. And it might lose the land bridge to Nakhichevan as well. And it is now in a very, very precarious position. It's, again, the EU, NATO, inserting themselves into a region they don't really understand, searching for geopolitical advantage, which is totally contrary to the true interests of the people who live there.
Yeah, because they have to expand, right? They
yes,
have to expand. Yeah.
Yes, as Alex said, absolutely.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. Armenia, they destroyed themselves. They really did. They really messed this one up. And Pashinyan he's a lightweight. He can't go up against Aliyev, and he definitely cannot go up against Erdogan. The guy's he's isolated himself now, and Armenia is going to lose more territory. That's just the bottom line. Azerbaijan's not going to stop. Doesn't make any sense for them to stop. I mean, if you're Azerbaijan, you're gonna keep on going.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Especially when you got Pashinyan sitting across from you at the table. I mean, you understand that this guy's a lightweight. You understand that this guy's deeply corrupt. You're going to roll all over him. So that's exactly what's going to happen. They're just waiting for the moment.
Yeah. And I do understand you're extremely busy. It's already more than an hour. Just one last question. Alexander is, although both of you are Greeks, Alexander is from UK, and Alex is from Cyprus. I would say Greece. Unfortunately, relationships between Russia and UK, Russia and Greece, although between Russia and Cyprus are somewhat in good terms, as I understand, not as bad as in other cases. But what is your thoughts about perspectives of improving relationships between Moscow and London, Moscow and Athens? Is there any chance for this in foreseeable future?
Well, first of all, in terms of Russia and Britain, I have to say at the moment I see absolutely no chance of it at all. I mean, I live in London. I mean, the degree of hostility to Russia here is just off the scale. It is worse, much worse than what you will see in the United States. I mean, in the United States, there is discussion and nuance, and there are some people who are prepared to come out and speak out against it. In Britain, no one of importance in the political class or indeed in the academic class is prepared to do that. So we are locked into this policy of hostility to Russia, which is utterly self-defeating and in the end completely terrible for us. But short of the collapse of NATO, which might one day come, I can't really see that the British are going to change their policies. Now, Greece is an entirely different matter because there the sentiments of the people are completely different, but much more so that even in Armenia, unfortunately, we have a political class in charge in Greece, a country, by the way, which Alex is closer to than I am, because I live in London. I truly travel to Greece occasionally, but Alex is regularly there. But we have a political class in Athens, which is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the United States and by the EU. And they will always do exactly what Washington and Brussels tell them. And until that changes, and there's no sign at the moment that it is going to change, I'm afraid Greece's distance from Russia is going to grow. And we now are in this disastrous situation where Russia has good relations with Turkey, which is the country that Greece was liberated from by Russia. I mean, people always forget this, is the Russians who actually liberated Greece from the Turks. We are now, the Russians have much better relations with Turkey and are at odds with us. I mean, that is a disastrous situation to be in, but I don't see any escape from it.
Yeah, Greece is going to do whatever the EU and the US tell it to do. I mean, the EU runs Greece's domestic policy, and the US runs Greece's foreign policy, and so there's not much to really talk about as far as Greece is concerned. People ask me, how come you don't talk about Greek politics and cover Greek politics? And I'm like, there's just nothing to really talk about. I mean, they're going to follow whatever the EU-US line is, and it's that simple. So NATO and the EU, when they break up, then Greece will find its sovereignty again. Let's hope that Russia is still there to welcome it. We'll see. Mm-hmm.
Well, at least on the level of societies, we are good, because in Russia, of course, everybody painfully receives these difficult relationships, especially between Russia and Greece. I'm not talking about United Kingdom, but when it comes to Greece, it's a very different story. It's Orthodox Christian culture in both countries, and it's sad to see. But at least on the level of society, public, we
the people of Greece are very favorable. I mean, they love Russians. I mean, they're very favorable towards Russians. Their cousins or their brothers or the Greeks, the Serbs. They have these feelings, but the government is just on a different wavelength.
It's a different story.
Yeah, different story.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for very interesting conversation. It's my pleasure to be host, and hopefully someday in the future I will have opportunity to talk to you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Levan.
Thank you. Thank you very much.